Good morning, Tatsmewi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for Serving Indigenous Idaho as part of the Safety and Resiliency Conference. I'm gonna pass it over to Amy to do some quick housekeeping items for y'all.
Good morning. My name is Amy York, and I'm with the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. I'm going to be here supporting Tai as a facilitator. I'll be looking for Q&A questions. Tai is really wonderful at kind of watching the chat and pulling out questions that are relevant at the time, but please do put questions in the chat, and then we will also at the end have a Q&A time that she can answer your questions. Since we're all on Zoom all the time, I always like to remind us, even though we're here a lot, just remember to mute yourselves and welcome. So I'll turn that back over to Tai.
Awesome. So we've been doing this for a year and a half, and I always forget the unmute part. I'm just going to go ahead and get my slideshow ready to go for you and then share my screen. While I'm doing that, I do want to let you know, give you some context. Share. Can you all see my screen? I can get it. And it's the screen, not my notes or anything. Okay. Really quick, Tatmewi inim lautiwa. Good morning, friends. Inim wanikwas atitwatit. My name is the storyteller. Soyapo wanikwas, Tai Simpson, in the indigenous language of my people, or in English, you can call me Tai Simpson. Sorry, I got that backwards. Inwas Nimipu Ayat. I am a citizen of the Nimipu Nation, commonly known as the Nez Perce tribe. Inim Nixasa Hiwis Timina Ilp Kanik. I am a descendant of Chief Red Heart of the Nez Perce Nation. And Laloita Kina, I'm very thankful and grateful to be here with you all. It is a good day. Gosh, I've got so many things going on the screen at this point. So you are now in the showing up in a good way, serving Indigenous Idaho, best practices for DV advocacy in Indigenous communities. This slideshow was built as part of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Peoples Conference hosted by the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence in October of 2020. But it is a culmination of the work that the Idaho Coalition has been doing in Indigenous communities for, I would say, the last year and a half, 2 years. And I will dig a little bit deeper into that as part of our discussion today. So what I did initially was tell you who I am in my Indigenous language. There's a couple of things that are important about that. Our language is a gift from the land, and we believe wholeheartedly that when we speak our language, we are honoring our ancestors and honoring the land from which we came. And this language is old. It's about 15,000 years old, give or take. That is the amount of time that my people have descendancy on what we now know as the United States, but we have other names for it in our Indigenous language. Introducing yourself in my Indigenous language is helping me to story myself to community. I am an Indigenous woman. I am Nimipu. I also identify as a Black woman. I am of the Nez Perce Nation. And these are things like, when you work with Indigenous communities, you'll notice that people will always introduce themselves by who their family is, by their nation, by their band, by their chief. And the reason why we do this is it's allowing us to not only say, I am Indigenous, but these are the Indigenous people, and this is the Indigenous land that claims me. I am broadcasting to you from Boise, Idaho, what we now know as Boise, Idaho, but it is the unceded territory of the Niwa and Numu nations, what we now commonly know as the Shoshone, Bannock, Paiute, and Yakima nations. And I encourage you to take a look at the link that Amy will drop into the chat that helps you identify on whose land you occupy as well. And that's an important recognition that we need to make, that our land acknowledgements aren't necessarily something to help us feel all the warm fuzzies, but they're really helping us to connect to whose land and which Indigenous people we are trying to serve. It is all Indian land. You'll hear us say that in Indian country. And really our responsibility as folks who are serving Indian country to know and understand whose land we're on, the history, their sovereignty, their jurisdiction, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into that as we move along as well. A couple of disclaimers. You will hear me use the terms Native, Native American, Indian, Indigenous, tribal, all interchangeably. My preference for folks is to use Indigenous, but Indian is often used because that's the language that we have with the federal government. They call us Indian country, treaties with American Indians. We are often called Native Americans sometimes, but Indigenous, I think, is the most appropriate and most accurate term of who we are as communities and nations across the country. And oh, as always, we're individual, we're not a monolith. So you may meet somebody else who's Indigenous who has a different preference. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew and were hearing me use these terms synonymously and interchangeably across our presentation and time today. You're getting also a very abridged version. I could spend, I have an hour and 15 minutes with you. I'm going to do my best to make a lot of room for questions. But this is really probably 8 hours worth of work that we could really dig into. So I just want you to know that I'm giving you a high level look at some of the work that we have done at the coalition and how that can inform your work at other agencies. And I am not a poster child for Indian country. I don't speak for all of Native America. I'm not a beauty queen for us. Like really, I'm just somebody who serves my people, and I hope I'm a good relative to my people, and I hope that I'm serving my people in a good way. And that's something I would really love for y'all to take away. I've based this webinar on reclaiming Native truth. Amy, if you can Google reclaiming Native truth really quick and drop a link in the chat, that would be really useful. Because reclaiming Native truth is designed to eradicate harmful and toxic narratives, stereotypes, structural and institutionalized racism, dehumanization, and the invisibility of Native Americans. And so it proved to be a really useful tool in framing how I presented this information to you. Why y'all are here, I hope, is that you can take away some high level learns from our grant work and listening sessions, because they've illuminated a significant need for narrative shifts in the way that we work in Indigenous communities. Our misconceptions about Indigenous people can adversely affect the way that we build community and serve these folks. What you can expect, you can explore your own behavior. And you can explore the behaviors of your agency and or your organization. And we can talk through a little bit about application when we have Q&A towards the end. And another thing too, in the same vein of being as poster child, this webinar is not going to be a checklist or an official guideline or an official framework or an instruction guide on how to serve or interact with Indigenous communities. It's not skill building. You are not here for skill building, and you will not be an expert on Native Americans after our time is done here. So I hate that in most spaces I have to name that, but really, like in my vast experience in serving and working with Native American communities, non-natives tend to take one webinar or one article or one book and then make themselves or fancy themselves an expert on the material. Really, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There are, countless number of languages, spiritual practices, cultural practices. So we are incredibly diverse and multifaceted within each of our nations, within each of our families, within those nations. So I just make sure that you're thinking very big picture and then holding some of this knowledge loosely as you approach your work with Native American folks. So the Idaho Thriving Families Grant is a grant from the Department of Health and Human Services, Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. We say HHS FIPSA because the government likes to give us alphabet soup. It was a 4-year grant, and the grant work began in Idaho focusing on Latinx communities, and then was later expanded to include Native American communities, resettled and refugee communities as well. I came in May of 2019, and I'll talk a little bit about that journey a little bit later about why I was brought into the team. But the Indigenous community focus really needed to be Indigenous led, and the Idaho Coalition didn't initially start our methodology that way. So when they brought me on, that was very purposeful as part of this grant. And then we also brought in my sister friend, Melanie Fillmore from Boise State, to help with the data analysis and research. Because we we have a cultural knowledge that can't be taught. And then we also have a storied connection already in place with the communities that we're serving in Idaho, which allowed us to help us repair and rebuild the relationships that the coalition had initially caused harm within. And then, really find a collective space where we could work to improve these systems and services for families. We can improve our systems for families seeking services after they've been affected by domestic violence. I do want to give a quick disclaimer. Even though this grant work was domestic violence specific, it's important to understand that violence, oppression, racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, Christianity are all intersections of marginalization and oppression that we have to address in all facets of service provision. I'm not just talking about victim services and anti-violence. I'm also talking about how do we operate in the court systems? How do we operate in the criminal legal system? How are we operating in CPS? Because a lot of the violence that's perpetuated within Native American communities is very similar, regardless of what agency that we are in or working from. So again, high level look at how we can change and improve these systems, and then also really looking internally about how can you bring these practices into your individual organizations and agencies. So our ultimate goal of the grant work was to improve systems and responses to abused families from underserved populations. I'm not a big reader, side note, of my own slides, so I will leave these up here for a few minutes to give them a gander. Also coordinate the provision of enhanced domestic violence services and coordinate a model to create meaningful access, and then enhance evidence and practice informed strategies, advocacy, and interventions for children and youth from underserved communities. So I'll leave these up, and please feel free to screenshot. And if at the end you want me to email this to you, you can drop that into the chat. I'm really happy to share this presentation with folks. Some questions that we had to ask ourselves as part of these goals is: how are Indigenous communities impacted by domestic violence? How are Indigenous families impacted by violence, violent victim service provision and healing? How are we improving our systems and responses with an anti-oppression and social equity framework? How are we coordinating enhanced service provision by informing policy and practice? And then when we talk about enhancing strategy and advocacy in response to violence, like, are we trying to be saviors, or are we allowing our service provision to be community informed? I also want you to hold on to that phrase: community informed, community led, community centered. That's going to be a common thread for all of our discussion today. We have a model of any victim service provision, of counseling, of healing, of placing children, of incarcerated young folks and adults, of always trying to, like, we have a bad habit of trying to be a savior rather than serving the stated needs of a community. So if there's anything that you take away, if you don't want to listen to anything else I have to say, let that be the lesson for you. If you are going to serve a Native American community, make sure that you are serving the stated needs of that community. Have they named what they need from you, and are you showing up to serve them in that way? And I'm sure the next question is, well, I try to show up, but I'm not getting any response. We will address that question later on as well. The process and the methodology, this is kind of the boring part for me, and usually where I have my sister jump in and talk about process and methodology. So we hosted listening sessions across Idaho. But in general, we had 11 program sites under the Idaho Thriving Families Grant and 3 tribal programs: the Stop Violence program with the Shitsuamsh or Coeur d'Alene tribe, Uyat Kimti New Beginnings program with the Ninipu or Nez Perce tribe, and then the Victim Assistance program with the Nua or Shoshone Bannock tribe down in Fort Hall. And then we also included, after Melanie and I were brought onto the team, a listening session to address urban Indian community near and around Boise, Idaho. The reason why we did that, because you may or may not know that 70% of Indigenous folks in the United States live in urban centers. We have this misconception that all of the Indian folks are living in these very rural, remote reservations, when that's not at all the fact. There are very small numbers of our population that still continue to live rurally, but 70% of us are in an urban center. For example, I'm in Boise, Idaho. We're thinking Seattle, Utah, San Francisco, Oakland, Minneapolis, and that's by design. I'm going to sidebar a little bit. There was an urban Indian relocation program that was a state sanctioned vocational program that promised money and jobs to Native American folks if they moved to these urban centers. This was fueled by capitalism. How much labor and productivity can we extract from these Native American communities? They only ended up in these urban centers with no money and no jobs, and have now created ultimately what are small pockets of Indian folks in these urban centers, now afflicted by abject poverty, high risk of MMIW, high risk of mental health needs and access, high rates of violence, homelessness, and food insecurity. So that's just a sidebar regarding the needs of urban Indian folks in addition to our rural Indigenous family. We compiled themes. Oh, I'm sorry, let me go back. We compiled themes out of those listening sessions. I'll talk about those a little bit. The questions, unfortunately, we were not able to generate. When I say we, I mean Melanie and myself were not able to generate the listening session questions. They were, in fact, too complicated. They were incredibly extractive, very data oriented, rather than allowing an organic conversation to arise out of these listening sessions where folks could share their story. They could share their story without shame, without guilt, that we could capture an outcome narrative versus really trying to check some boxes. So there was some complications there. If ever you need to offer a survey or an assessment in Indian country, please have Indigenous folks from that community give you feedback on those questions, just to make sure that one, the language is accessible, it makes sense, and it's not extractive or triggering. The thing that the Idaho Coalition failed to do as part of our listening session work is we did not provide aftercare or on-site counseling care for some of these young people who were telling and sharing stories about their experiences with sexual and domestic violence. And that we have to be much more responsible in the way that we spend time in these communities. And I offer this as there's a lot of compassion and a lot of grace that I'm giving the coalition. One, of course, I'm biased. I work there, but I also want to offer this feedback and transparency, because I don't want this to happen in any other agency. I don't want all of our state and local community organizations and agencies to show up in Indian country, all of us extracting this knowledge and these stories from these communities and not doing it in a good way, right? Like when we talk about doing things in a good way, that means that we have the best intentions, that we are doing our best with the most information that we've been able to receive, and that we are also not there to do any harm. And at all points of the time that we spend with these tribal communities, we have to make sure that we're open to the constant feedback, critical or constructive or otherwise, just to make sure that folks are taken care of as part of their interactions with us. So I hope that makes sense. And then Melanie did some of the transcription process following all of the recorded listening sessions, and then that helped us to develop the themes. So I'm going to stop for a little bit here to talk about some of the lessons learned. But I also want to bring your attention to this map over here. On the map, you can see the Kootenai Reservation way up north remotely. They're served by, I think, Boundary County. They're served by Boundary County Domestic Violence Victim Services. The Coeur d'Alene Nation is bucked up next to the border and has some partnerships with Safe Passages. Uyat Kimti is near the border of Washington as well, and has some partnerships with the YWCA and then advocates on the Palouse. And then you see Duck Valley Indian Reservation, which straddles Idaho and Nevada, and then the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. So what's a couple of things I want you to take away: how remote these reservations are, how big they are, geographically speaking, and how like awkward their shapes are. And then of course the jurisdictional complications of being straddling two states. So going back to the lessons learned, who represents community during the planning process, right? So when we were building this grant, from the point of writing the grant all the way up until building the questions, the listening sessions, and then building themes, was community part of that conversation? What the coalition did, which was a lesson learned, was built this incredible grant program, this incredible grant narrative. And then we showed up in community and said, hey, here's the things we want to do. At no point in that conversation did we show up in community and say, hey, we have access to these resources. What are the gaps in services that you're seeing? What are needs that you have that we could support and help? What are you hearing from community about things that they need for healing and for resilience? We didn't take our cues from the communities we were trying to serve. We were just showing up with resources and enthusiasm and hoping for the best. That is not the way you serve Indigenous communities. Ultimately, what happens is you show up and you have this money and say, hey, yay, please spend all this money. But then it comes with restrictions. It comes with a pile of paperwork. It comes with a pile of reporting. And there's no real meaningful way for those communities to spend that money in a way that serves the needs of the tribal folks. So that is the hugest lesson learned that we took away, is somebody from community informing this process from the very, very beginning. And even in your brainstorming of like, okay, here's this grant, let me get some input from a tribe, or a victim service provider who works with a tribe, or a tribal leader, or somebody who can offer some insight in the way that that money can be distributed and disseminated in community. Somebody from community has to inform your process. I can't underscore or scream that enough. The questions, again, going back to the questions that we had asked as part of the listening sessions, they were really just drab to the point sort of questions. Tell me about your experience with domestic violence. What service provider did you see and why? You know, if you could, if you had to endure this experience again, what would you hope would happen? You know, like just really not well thought out, careful questions. And when we were writing the assessment of this grant as the grant sundown last year, we still didn't have a clear idea of where the questions came from or how they were developed. Somebody has to always have that answer, and somebody should always be able to justify where and how those questions were developed. Let's see. Is someone from community informing the process? That's me. I am the person from community that is informing the process. Now that I'm on staff, I am able to offer cultural insight, spiritual insights, historical knowledge about intergenerational trauma, historical context to why violence takes place at far greater numbers than any other race in the country. I mean, those are issues and insights that I'm able to offer because I was born and raised in community, because my undergraduate research and understanding academically is about this community as well. And it helps me to show up and interrupt cycles of extractive grant work, extractive narratives, extractive data, and because I'm able to interrupt, it's an act of gatekeeping, but not gatekeeping in a way that's about asserting power and privilege. This is gatekeeping where I'm preventing any further harm from taking place within these Native communities, when after 450 some odd years, we've seen folks coming in to extract from these tribal communities in one way or another. So that's why I'm on the team from community informing the grant process, and will continue to do so, and ideally mentor somebody else to take my place in the event that I leave the coalition in the future. Methodology matters. Again, this is a really great question from Melanie, and I wish she were joining us today, but Are you using standard Western white academic practices, or are you informed on Indigenous methodology? Have you read Pedagogy of the Oppressed? Have you read Indigenous methods? Are your practices for analyzing and transcribing, including voices of Indigenous folks as well? Here's the particular example of that. When we did the initial listening sessions in the Latinx community, it was a white woman from the university who transcribed these listening sessions from Spanish, uh, and um, and then built the themes. The three Latinx women that we had on staff at the time read through the themes report, read through the transcription, and there was some disconnect between what community was trying to say, what idiosyncrasies were they using, what nuance were they using, what jargon and colloquialisms were they using that the white woman did not catch as part of her transcription and analysis process. The same goes for Indian country. The way that we communicate in Indian country is very story based. It is very broad and nuanced, and there's layers upon layers in our stories. So if you don't have somebody who understands that method of communicating, you're really going to miss a lot of information. And so what happened, and as a solution, the three Latinx women that we had on staff at the time reread the transcription and extracted the themes that were more appropriate culturally, spiritually, um, uh, to their community based on their knowledge of being in community. So, I mean, making sure that you have somebody informing that methodology process so those pieces aren't missed. And another example I describe of this too is like any book written on Native Americans in the 1970s, 1960s, where there was this anthropological era of just like making a monolith of all Native American people. Like the term Native Americanism came from that era where everybody was just plopped together in the same group without identifying the diversity and facets of Native American communities. And it's incredibly damaging, right, to minimize the unique voices of each community and to minimize the unique way that each community shares their own story. So again, who is helping you inform this process, and are you using an Indigenous community focused lens while you're analyzing and transcribing your data? This is also the last bullet point here I want to spend some time on. I am a sociologist and a political scientist. And it's important to understand that this violence, again, like is at the intersections of oppression and marginalization, but we have to consider the geographical and sociological obstacles to folks participating in our assessments, in our grant programming, in anything that we show up in community to try to offer. We operate on the assumption that internet exists everywhere, and it doesn't. I stayed at my brother's house a couple of times during COVID. My brother lives very remotely, and like the hay bales were in the way of the internet repeater one day. Like I couldn't have the internet because the hay bales were stacked too high. Like that, it's laughable. I actually laugh about it all the time. But it's a very serious reality for folks in Indian country. Is the wind blowing the wrong way and we're not getting the internet? If it's raining in some of these valleys, they can't have the internet. Like, do they have technology that's strong enough to catch an internet signal and participate in some of this remote internet-based surveys, webinars, etc.? If we want somebody to show up in person, it takes about an hour and a half at least to drive from one end of my reservation to the other. And it's not on an easy road. It's called the Gauntlet. If you've driven Highway 12 along Clearwater River, you know that it's deep drop into the river on one side of the road and rocky and mountainous on the other side, on the opposite side. And then we're also operating under the assumption that community members can drive themselves. Sometimes 1, 2, 3 people share one car in a household. And then we operate under the assumption that they can afford the gas to get there. I know a lot of our funding operates on reimbursement, but that's not helpful when these folks don't have money in the first place to be able to invest in getting from point A to point B to participate in our grant programs, to get to court, to get to their lawyer, to get to town, like any number of geographical and socioeconomic obstacles in this particular case. So when we have these grant programs, when we are building programs to serve Indigenous communities, are we looking at the big picture? Money access, car access, technology access. Do our elders have a driver? Because sometimes these young folks will leave their elders at home, assuming that they don't have needs or need to be anywhere. Our young people who are, between the ages of like 5 and 15, when we build youth programs, are we ensuring that they have access to transportation? So really digging deep, not just looking at surface level, assuming everybody has a computer, assuming everybody has the internet, really challenging our own assumptions about what's happening in these communities when it comes to their participation in our programs. So really keep that in mind. Um, I'm going to pause for a second. Let me give a gander to the chat. I don't see anything that's really come up. No questions as of this point. Okay, let's see. And I just want to stop and take a cup of coffee. I hope all of you, this is a Monday, Tuesday, which means it's Monday because Monday wasn't really Monday. So it's Monday, Tuesday today. Please honor your human needs if you need to step away and get some water, have some snacks. I'm not anybody that's ever offended by that. Meanwhile, I'm drinking my first cup of coffee this morning. Our listening session themes, again, these listening sessions were specifically the Native American community listening sessions from each of the 3 tribes and the urban Indian community. Here's what we heard. We need significant narrative shifts. We need to tell strength-based stories of Native American communities because false narratives are created by non-Native people to perpetuate oppression. And when I say that, that's saying like, oh, look at these Indigenous people and all of their problems. Look at these Indigenous people who need us to save them. Look at these Indigenous people who don't know how to save or take care of themselves. That is a false narrative that's harmful and problematic because it's saying that Indigenous folks are really like in this cycle of problem saturation that they created for themselves when that's not at all the case. As a reminder, violence in Indigenous communities, poverty in Indigenous communities, economic disparity in Indigenous communities, lack of access to healthcare and education are all symptoms of settler colonialism. By design, we were put in these remote communities that were ultimately prisons from the offset to keep us out of the way while land was being divvied out to white settlers. So settler colonialism caused a lot of these disparities, if not all of these disparities in our communities. And we are really doing our best to survive, to build resilience, to build strength, to find and create spaces for healing for ourselves. So let's really look at our own internal understanding of Native Americans. Who do you know that's Indigenous? What books have you read? Who do you follow on social media? Who are the Indigenous academics that you follow and read? Do you have Indigenous people on staff? Are you well versed in the history, jurisdiction, and sovereignty of the land that you're occupying? I'll get to that in just a moment as well. So those are some questions that you can be asking yourself around narrative shifts. What do you actually know about Indigenous people? And is that information being derived solely from movies, solely from mascots, solely from social media and mass media, news media? I mean, if we all spent our time listening to Rick Santorum, we'd have some really horrible perspectives on who Native American folks are in this community. So really take a look, ask internally of yourself, ask internally of your organization and your agency, what do you know about Indigenous people? Another theme that arose for us is that each of our tribal victim service programs are run by women, and those women are matriarchs in their communities. So the listening session participants expressed the need to see or be with Indigenous people within working within service provision because it relieves the burden of explaining sovereignty and jurisdiction, or just the historical trauma that impacts Indigenous people as a whole. So it relieves the burden to explain identity. So let me say that in a different way. Representation matters, right? So in victim service provision, there is a, a facet of peace that we feel when we see ourselves represented in victim service provision. There is a sense of relief when we see ourselves represented in public defenders. There is a sense of relief when we see ourselves represented in child protective services, like in like counselors. I, in my therapist is an Indigenous woman. It took me nearly a year to find her, and it gives me a sense of relief and peace to be able to show up and talk about some of these issues that I'm feeling as an Indigenous woman trying to navigate a settler, colonial, white, supremacist, patriarchal world. And I don't have to explain to her what that means because she also understands the feeling. And that is so very important for any organization serving an Indigenous community. Do you have Indigenous representation, and do you have matriarchs? I call the three women who run these victim service providers, these three victim service providers, my aunties. One that's just a name and a title of respect in Indigenous communities, that I am a baby matriarch and they are the matriarchs. And I have a responsibility to learn everything I can for them. And in turn, they have a responsibility to share their knowledge with me so that it's passed on to the next generation. So they're not only advocates, but they have a strong cultural knowledge that is unique to their life and professional experience that we really need to respect when it comes to offering services within Native American communities. Elders as mentors. Where do we go when violence occurs? Victim service providers try to be accessible, but unless you have a known elder or staff, or somebody accessible, you're about the third or fourth choice for help. So it's the homes of elders that we look for shelter and solace first. And generally, these elders have their own stories of violence and trauma, and they make themselves approachable. And part of Melanie's report, she wrote, knowledge in the face of a crisis is important, and those who know how to navigate situations would be sought after. So if one of those listening sessions, for example, a young woman had gone to her grandma several times, finally, before her grandmother had finally helped her navigate going into the victim service provider for the financial resources and support, transitional housing, etc. The reason why she was seeking out her elder instead is because those elders create space where we can be vulnerable, where we can be transparent, where we can be honest, where this elder, unfortunately, also has a similar experience in their lifetime where they can speak to, how to navigate the very tumultuous emotions we feel in crisis. And elders are where the heart is, right? Like, not home is where the heart is. Wherever our elders are is where our heart is. Our entire cultural and Indigenous communities are couched in, our elders and in our babies. So finding that space and creating spaces where elders are also included as part of your programming is really, really important. How do you do that? This is one of the most complicated relationships that you can build in Indigenous communities, is because we gatekeep our elders' time and space in a very deep way. We want our elders to be honored and revered, kept safe, have abundance, be thriving in their old age. And so when it comes to building relationships with elders, you really also have to look at like how what cultural knowledge that you have. Are you a safe non-native person for our elders to talk to? Are you showing up with gifts? Do you know how to say good morning and good evening in the language of that elder? Like, those are really important pieces of connection that you have to learn and earn over time. So and I would say this too for a lot of elder services and programs, that no relationships are built with these elders when we're building these programs. So we really got to look at how we're shifting that interaction. Um, there is a perfect example of this is one of the victim service providers actually has just a volunteer elder, just a volunteer grandma as a receptionist in their shelter. And she helps with the intake process by offering smudge, by offering stories, hot coffee, and just that familiar auntie face, that familiar grandma face really changes how those victims in life crisis are able to seek services. And so we over professionalize all of our work as service providers, as counselors, as judges, as lawyers. We make everything so compartmentalized and so overstructured that we just don't think about the basic needs humans have when we're in crisis. Is there food? Is there coffee? Is there an elder? Is there a grandma? Like, think about the comfort we each get when we go home to our families. How are we not recreating that in our services and in our programs, right? What do you need as a human to feel comfortable? What do you need as a person when you're feeling strife? Like, you go home to your family, you go home to your grandparents. We absolutely need to create that, recreate that in our programs and in our services. So think about the way that that could take place and think about what relationships you need to build with tribes in order to make that happen. Sovereignty and jurisdiction. What are the choices regarding how we access services? This was again, the driving versus the gas versus the distance versus the safety. So those are those hard questions about sovereignty and jurisdiction. What authority responds to violence when violence is taking place in the moment? And it becomes very complex. I don't dive too deep into this because because it can be very complicated, but I will give you an example. So bear with me, and I'm sure you guys are going to have questions about this. This is going to be violence specific. So ask yourselves, what happens when violence takes place? The perpetrator is, I'll use Nez Perce as an example, is Nez Perce, but the victim is not Native at all. What happens on the reservation when the perpetrator is white and the victim is Nez Perce? And they're on the Nez Perce Indian reservation? What happens when the violence takes place on the Nez Perce reservation with a Nez Perce victim and a non-Native perpetrator who lives off the reservation? What happens on the Nez Perce Indian reservation when the victim is Yakima, for example, but the perpetrator is non-Native and they're on the Nez Perce Indian reservation? What happens when the victim and the perpetrator are both Nez Perce, but they live off the reservation? What happens around victim services when it's a Nez Perce perpetrator and a non-native victim also living off the reservation? So you see how complicated that gets. Who could get involved, you ask? The FBI can be involved. State police can be involved. County police can be involved. The Nez Perce reservation covers 5 counties alone. So what does that look like? City police, municipal police can be involved. Who has court jurisdiction over these instances of violence? So having a strong understanding of how complicated sovereignty and jurisdiction is for each tribe will really, really improve the way that you can serve Indigenous communities. What are the boundaries? What are the treaties? What does the jurisdictional map look like? How does the tribe govern themselves? Are they a business council? Are they a tribal council? Is there a general tribal council? Is there an office of legal counsel, right? So that, like, having an understanding of how money moves in a tribe, what the decision-making process looks like in a tribe. And I'll give you another example of that. If you need an MOU with the tribe, it'll go to the program first that you are trying to get an MOU with. From there, that MOU moves into the tribal council. Tribal council reviews it, then pushes it into the Office of Legal Counsel to make sure that it can stand up in court, what have you. Office of Legal Counsel will then push it back to tribal council. Tribal council makes a resolution and then pushes it back to the program within the tribe that you're trying to have an MOU with in the first place. That process could take anywhere between 2 weeks to 12 weeks, depending on the traffic in and out of the tribal council, traffic in and out of the Office of Legal Counsel, how busy is the program itself. So again, having a strong understanding of jurisdictional process, of red tape, of bureaucracy, of sovereignty will really, really improve your relationships with the tribe, because then you know where to go, who to go, which subcommittee within tribal council do you need to show up and argue your case with, who is the um, who is your contact in the office of legal counsel, right? So what we think is just a simple signature from our end actually ends up being 6 or 7 people from a tribal end that need to be involved in that process. And that takes place because we just have so few resources in our tribes left, and we want to make sure that we share collective decision making. So a lot of that isn't just about bureaucracy, it really is just about transparency and making sure everybody in the community knows what's happening, and that we're not signing memorandums of understanding, because signing treaties sure went well for us, right? Like we have a bad taste in our mouth when it comes to contracts and agreements in general. So keeping in mind that we have a cultural apprehension to signing things for y'all, that you need to understand, and that affects sovereignty and how sovereignty and jurisdiction plays out. So that I again could spend literal hours on sovereignty and jurisdiction alone. Each of these themes could be its own 2-hour session, but I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So moving into the last piece, access to ceremony. So Indigenous people have been cut off from our access to ceremony since the beginning. That was the first relationship that was severed upon contact with white folks and settlers and during westward expansion. It results from the displacement and forced removal from our ancestral homelands, and our practices are often taken out of context. Like y'all have, I'm sure in your lifetime, have used the term spirit animal way out of context. Don't ever say that. That's actually cultural appropriation. When we talk about going sweat, white folks have appropriated sweat lodge and sweat house and have now turned into spas and these like authentic Native American experiences. Practitioners of spirituality, like that's also, has ties to indigeneity that are taken out of context. So for us, coincidentally, or actually conversely, ceremony could be just a place of laughter, going sweat, a place where community feels safe. It could be a place of storytelling or cultural practice like powwow or longhouse. And it doesn't have to be this big, complicated thing that you incorporate as part of your grant programming. Really, it could just be a line item that you can put a line item in the budget where you say you can go buy sweetgrass, you can purchase shells and lighters, you can host a support group where you're actually making ribbon skirts, sponsoring a field trip to ancestral homelands for gathering of roots or resources. I mean, that could look any kind of way. And in our grant language, we can really say like we are supporting cultural programming for healing spaces. We are supporting cultural programming for thriving, resiliency, strength, healing, like all of those things, because it's deep, deep in our culture and in our ceremony where we find our healing. Everybody, nearly everybody in the listening session mentioned something about ceremony. Everybody, which is saying like, how can we incorporate ceremony as part of our services? Do you have posters that represent Native American imagery? Or are there signage in your offices in our language and also in English, right? Do you have sweetgrass or sage, and have you offered it to your client or participants in your program? Like it's any of those small things that are saying like, I understand my Western white way of providing services isn't necessarily the best way to serve Indigenous community, but I want you to know that these tools are here and available to you. So what does that look like in practical application for you? So I hope that's a question that you're asking yourselves. Best practices. I hate using the term best practices because it doesn't really allow for fluidity or nuance. And this is where I want to reiterate why this is not a checklist. These are best practices, and yet make sure that your practices are informed by somebody in community. Work from community strengths. So include and facilitate access to traditional healing like smudge, ceremony and medicine, art, holidays. Do you know our tribal holidays? Storytelling, celebrations, etc. One example, there's a program around horse therapy for the Nez Perce tribe where these young folks, especially young folks who have endured traumatic experiences, either from substance abuse or violence, are able to participate in a horse therapy program where they interact with the horse, they learn how to take care of the horse, they learn how to ride the horse. And we also learn about the cultural stories about why horses are important to Nimi-Pu people. A cultural program that is creating a space for healing. It doesn't what we understand as healing and what we understand as, therapy doesn't have to always come out of a book. We have to really expand our knowledge and our perspective of what that means for folks who have been navigating settler colonialism and intergenerational trauma for literally 500, 600 years. So think about asking folks, like, what has your community done for survival and resilience, and how can you incorporate those practices into your services and programs? Cultural relevance. Are you using our language? Are you creating spaces for storytelling? Are you allowing for storied data? A lot of our grant work, I know I'm not alone in this, requires surveys and assessments and 70-page reports. And I say that because I just submitted one a few months ago. And it has graphs and tables and charts. How can we convey the work that we're doing to our funders using storied data, using the stories that we're hearing from community versus asking communities to fill out 10 and 15 and 20-minute surveys, right? Like, we don't have capacity for that. Folks aren't going to open that email and be enthusiastic about sharing their experience. So what does is it excuse the data that we have when we're trying to create reports on victim service data, rather than being able to just take these narratives and analyzing them in such a way that becomes useful for us. We need to be doing the work as folks who are building this grant programming, as researchers, as data analysts, as social scientists. We just take the story and we make meaning of it, ideally with input from community, and then put it in the report from there versus just demanding assessments and surveys. Because I promise you, I try to do all the surveys and stuff, and I am well versed in code switching. I can navigate both spaces well. And surveys and assessments are just time consuming and overwhelming sometimes. And the questions are confusing because the language isn't accessible. We really have to rethink then that cultural relevance, incorporating accessible language, et cetera. This one I cannot underscore enough. I really could also spend several hours talking about addressing oppression. We cannot and should not be building programming or services for any community of color if we are not also talking about intersectionality, about racism, about transphobia, about Eurocentrism, socioeconomic access. I could go on and on and on. If we're not addressing your implicit bias, if we're not addressing your internalized your racism, if we are not addressing how that shows up and plays out in your work, if you're not addressing your prejudices, like those are, and having those honest conversations in your workspaces and in your organizations. Like, are you having conversations about oppression, because that oppression perpetuates violence against Native American communities, whether you intend to or not. This is where your intentions will have to take a seat. You can show up and think that you're the nicest, best person in the world, but being nice doesn't undo white supremacy. Being nice doesn't undo racism. And those are some very honest, difficult conversations that we have to incorporate in our agencies and organizations if we are going to show up in these predominantly Indigenous spaces or predominantly Latinx spaces or these refugee and resettled spaces. We have to have these conversations about how our individual selves are showing up with this bias, prejudice, racism, and how does that show up in our work thereafter. So we can, some of the book suggestions that Amy and I will drop in the chat for you will have an exploration of some of these. And I hope that you, if you don't read the books, at least go look up the authors and look up some of their YouTube videos. There's always different ways to access and consume their media and their knowledge. And I really hope y'all take the time to do that, because I don't have time to walk y'all through anti-racism education in my time with you today. So here are my recommendations. Again, not a checklist, even though I ironically used check marks on the screen. Funding allocation to build community and technical assistance in full collaboration with tribal service providers. And this is stemming from us showing up with money and enthusiasm and then the tribe not being able to spend it, right? Before you build a budget, just ask the tribe what they need, right? Like, should be able to show up with money that they can actually spend. And I can tell you, we had to pivot our budget at the coalition in this grant because we didn't make it easy for the tribes to spend the money. And in the face of a COVID crisis, they didn't have time to pivot. So we had to pivot for them. We had to show up in a different way with that money so they could make use of it in community, but then they were not also responsible for the reporting, et cetera, or implementation of programming. Is your funding accessible? Support information for community development, support information around jurisdiction and sovereignty, create spaces for ceremony and storytelling. So when I say that as part of like tribal specific technical assistance, right? And if you don't know how to do that, I recommend gandering through the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I recommend any of the Indigenous webinars from Promising Futures. There are countless resources available for you with best case examples and scenarios on how to shift your programming and services in a way that is most meaningful to Native American communities. When it comes to really centering Native voices, every example out of Hawaii is my favorite. And then there are a handful out of Alaska as well. And the reason why they say that is because the system and institutionalized change that they made in Hawaii is that no decision about anything ever is made without Native Hawaiians. Like they always, what's the impact on the land, what's the impact on the people, do these resources take away from Native Hawaiians? Is there an adverse impact on the land? Are there spaces for healing and storytelling? Everything is so centered around Native Hawaiians. And that's why so much of their programming flourishes and has a strong impact. Their participation rates are often into the hundreds, sometimes thousands. They have partnerships with schools, with the court system, with CPS. Like they really are doing an excellent job about centering Native voices in everything, literally everything that they do. Really look closely at your ethical, at data collection. And what kind of oversight do you have in place? Like who is giving you feedback on your programming, right? If you build this programming and this service and you get no response or participation from Native American communities, I promise that's because you've done it wrong. You have not shown up in a good way. No response is a response. I will say that for you one more time. No response is a response. If you have reached out, called, left messages, you have not shown up in a way that Native American communities or programs are receptive to. So really it's just easier for them to give you no response and take that as a response. I encourage you then to look at what have you presented? Have you made your funding accessible? Is the language accessible even in your emails? Are your emails too long? Is there a way that you can just show up and bring food and introduce yourself? FaceTiming, face to face, not FaceTiming on an iPhone, but like face-to-face interactions are really important in community now that we can safely, with COVID precautions, go back outside and see one another. I would recommend maybe a lunch and learn, asking the program or service within the reservation that you're trying to help offer a lunch and learn, but you pay for the food. That's the other thing too, food, feed everybody. I would say most, if not all, Indigenous communities have a cultural practice of sharing food together and building community over shared meals. So if you show up with no food, or if you want folks to show up to something, always offer food. If you call together Indigenous people and don't feed them, that should have been an email. Email them if you're not going to feed them. That's like a huge cultural practice. And it's really easy, right? Show up with food, show up with snacks, show up with fruit, show up with a snack tray, like any number of ways. But food is love, and food is cornerstone in Indigenous communities. So if you ever have to have a meeting, food, always food. And then that piece, I'm going to circle that back to the oversight and ethical. Are you open to constant feedback loops? In Indigenous communities, we practice community care, we have community accountability, but what that means is that we're always accountable to one another in constantly. There is no like, well, this is my lane and this is my job and that's not my problem. No, we share problems, we share success, we share joy, we share community, we share love. All of it is shared in our communities. And so our expectation for you, if you show up as a non-native person trying to implement services or programs, are you also open to feedback if you get it wrong? And don't take that feedback personal. We just want you to be the best you can in community. Are you showing up? Are you showing up in a way that is like fluid, right? Don't like, here's the outline, here's the structure, this is the way we have to do it. No, allow folks to inform in real time what it is that you want. A perfect example of that is the listening session that we held in urban Indian community between my sister and I. More folks showed up than we expected, so but we fed them. And there was a woman there who really wanted to share her experience with violence, but she couldn't get through the conversation without crying or tearing up. And we want to make sure that we had held space for her in a meaningful way. And if that meant not hearing her story, but listening to her share other stories about joy and success in her life, then so be it. We have to be able to just accept what gifts Indigenous communities are giving us, regardless of if it meets our goals for programming, if it meets our grant deliverables. We have to be open to flexibility and fluidity, however that comes, because everything is a gift out of Indian country. We've been, again, like the problem saturation exists in Indian country, but there are also solutions in Indian country. And those solutions often live in our stories. These are some resources. Actually, these are all still really great resources. Um, so instead of the showing webinar series, Amy, if you can share the MMIP playlist off of YouTube, I'm glad that you're 5 steps ahead of me. Share the link for our podcast. The podcast is fantastic because it's actually stories from community that we captured in podcast format. And it explores each of the themes that I talked about today, but it's all very sobering in that it's very emotional. You can hear the emotional turmoil, you can hear the hope, but you can hear joy, you can hear laughter, but all of it is around like, how do we interrupt violence in our communities, and how can we inform the way non-natives show up for services in our communities? It's a conversation on what not to do, conversations on how to be better neighbors, how to be better counselors, how to be better representatives for your particular agencies. So please give that a listen. I think it's max 2 hours of listening time, probably closer to an hour and a half between 4 episodes. So please give that a listen. Other sources, resources for technical assistance, and don't think that these are just violence related. Like if it's a best practice in one agency, it's likely going to be a best practice across all agencies, right? Like we're out here in our anti-violence. We're also in like addiction and recovery. We're in CASA, we're in CPS, we're counselors, like, so any number of places that we show up. But I promise you, all of these best practices are interconnected. All of our work in Indigenous communities is interconnected. So let's, I really want to underscore that for y'all. Yeah, so here is my email if you need me. But I will actually put this in the chat so I can stop sharing and take your questions. I'm good with pregnant pauses too. So you can feel free to ask your question to me in private in chat, or I will invite you to come off mute and ask your question if you have one.
Hey, thank you so much. That was really fantastic. And I'm learning a lot. My focus is on stalking, and I was wondering if you would, I know that there's like, you know, issues in some communities of like with like man camps, and you know, people like Indigenous communities essentially being like targets. Do you know, like, the extent to which that happens in Idaho and the extent, like what kind of maybe stalking issues, if you've observed any, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. So if I understand you, like, what is my awareness around stalking in Indigenous communities?
Yes.
So here, yeah, no, that's a great question. A few stats for you. Like, I'm not a big stats person. I'm more of a narrative person. But so Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be assaulted in our lives. We are 2 times more likely to be stalked in our lives, 5 times more likely to experience interracial violence, and interracial being predominantly white partners. I think it's like 80% white partner of that interracial violence. 10 times more likely to be murdered on some reservations than non-natives. And then about 35% of us will be raped in our lifetime. I am one of the 35%. I have been raped in my life. And 60% of Indigenous women will be physically assaulted. I have also endured a physically violent physically violent relationship. So all of those things like are kind of the high level look at that. But stalking also is this really interesting thing where we don't have honest conversations about what stalking looks like, right? So cyberbullying, in fact, is stalking. Showing up at the house, somebody's house in the middle of the night is stalking. Following folks to the store is stalking. Abuse, like following each other around at school is stalking. So I would really love to see like some of these programs around stalking awareness show up in high schools, like elementary schools, high schools. And some of my like big vision for addressing this violence in Indian country is also about like, how do we learn as adults to have these stories and conversations with young people? You know, because we do this thing where we're like, oh, young people can't handle a conversation. No, like if young people are experiencing violence, like again, Indigenous women will, what are the stats? The women who do endure sexual violence in their lifetime, a majority of those women experience that violence before they're 12 years old. So if 12-year-olds are having these experiences, but we are not having these conversations about these experiences or giving these young people language to talk about stalking and sexual assault and molestation, we're doing our communities a disservice. And we have to be really honest about that. So honestly, stalking occurs intertribally more often than it occurs interracially. Because stalking, and this is my understanding, and I'm taking this from Sarah Deer. So that book recommendation, Amy, you can go and drop those book recommendations. In Sarah Deer's book, The Beginning and End of Rape, there's a conversation about how white men cannot stalk Indigenous women. I'm sorry, excuse me. I have 2 big dogs and they decide they want to participate in our conversation right now. I lost my train of thought. White perpetrators of violence are not stalkers for the most part. They will, if they identify a woman as Indigenous, the violence happens rather quickly thereafter. Like we're easy preyable targets because we're seen as outside the protections of the American legal system. So that happens more often near man camps, the proliferation of extractive resource camps, that kind of thing. So all of that to say, yes, stalking is really interesting because it happens so deep within community that if you are non-native, I encourage you to build relationships with the service provider in community to get in community to address the issue of stalking, because it's very intimate within us, right? So to have somebody who is non-native show up and say, I've got these resources to interrupt stalking, like you're really still standing on the outsides. And then the assumption that we'll make is like, well, what does she know about us? We get really defensive about it. Indian country gets really defensive when white folks show up. Rightly so, like settler colonialism.
I agree.
Done some serious damage. And yet, I think that is where we could do a lot. There is room for growth in the way that we interrupt stalking in Indian country, because stalking ultimately is the predecessor to deeper, more violent interactions, right? So stalking is violent, but it's not physical violence yet. And it could be and would likely be thereafter. So I encourage you to take my recommendations about building relationships with victim service providers and youth programs within tribes. I can get you some contact information for folks. Relationships. Yeah, I'm happy to help you with that. If you can just email me that request and I'll take a look at it. Did you see my email in the chat by chance?
Yes, I'm about to grab it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Awesome. Somebody asked me in chat about what best foods to share. My mom is the diabetes coordinator for Nimipu Health, our clinic up in Lapwai, Idaho, and she doesn't like it when I tell people to just bring like donuts, but everybody loves donuts. And also, but like I always show up with those little like meat trays with meat and crackers and stuff, and then a veggie tray, and that always makes people happy because everybody needs snacks. And it doesn't have to be a full-blown like steak and potatoes meal, just food of some sort, right? It can be, don't overthink the food thing. Like if you find joy in the food, we will also find joy in the food. I do caution folks against homemade things, and this is a personal bias of mine. I'm allergic to coconut, and everybody loves to cook with coconut nowadays, and then I die. So be careful, like home cooked things with like standard ingredients. Gluten sensitivity is actually really low in Indian country, surprisingly. So I wouldn't ever, but always honor folks' dietary needs if you are going to have a sit down dinner of some sort. So those are my basic food recommendations. The auntie at the Coeur d'Alene tribe victim service provider, like she loves to send tea to everybody. So if you show up to her and you bring her tea, she would really love you for that. Like tea is her love language. Every auntie for the different programs has a different love language, and I'm happy to share those with you if you ever need to interact with those ladies. Were there any other questions I can answer? I think somebody asked me for the stats that I just rattled off, didn't you? Any other questions?
Hi, this is Lacey with the coalition. I have a quick question for you. I was wondering if you could provide some insight or feedback on perhaps how can individuals provide feedback to funders or financial gatekeepers who share that they want to work in collaboration with or in partnership or provide meaningful funding to Indigenous peoples, but they're either not allowing or restricting like development of like traditional healing practices or complementary healing offerings, like rooted in, in the people they're claiming they want to serve, but they won't allow those types of things taking place. I mean, I know that's actually, it's happening with funders we work with. They're starting to eliminate that type of those line items. And then I also know that like just programs in general, some frequently don't see perhaps the benefit to them. And I think a lot of it's rooted in like people aren't showing up. And that again goes back to kind of what you were talking about earlier with if they're not showing up, they're actually telling you things. It's not because these things don't have value, but I wonder if you could just kind of touch on like how individuals can talk to funders or gatekeepers on why this is important funding, and then also how individuals can talk to programs on why this is essential to serving populations that they're claiming they want to serve and work within.
Yeah, oh, I love that question, Lacey. Thank you so much. Any opportunity I have to tell people this information, I will take it. I know what tends to happen when we over professionalize our work is that we tiptoe around funders when they have these feedback sessions. I don't tiptoe around anybody. So much damage and harm and loss has taken place in Indigenous communities that I refuse to be silent when these questions come up. You have money and you have enthusiasm. I'm telling you that this is how the community needs you to show up. Versus like, oh, this is so great, we'll make it work. We can't make it work, because if we make it work, that's the whole square peg round hole thing, right? Like if a community needs yoga, we show up with yoga. If a community needs blankets, coffee cups, bicycles, journals, candles, we show up with those items because those things are the most culturally appropriate. And acknowledging that, like, if we approaching our funding of from our own lens, like our own over professionalized lens of like, I am a counselor and in my social work courses, this is what I learned and this is the way it needs to be. We're doing ourselves a disservice by one, not showing up wholly as who we can be in community, and also doing a disservice by being culturally inappropriate in a very blatant way. Not everything is Western, not everything is white, not everything is Christian, not everything is patriarchal. And that is really the most difficult thing to let go of because it's so deeply ingrained in all of us. So if it's not those things, then what is it, right? And then we get uncomfortable, and then we get a little twitchy about like, oh, I'm going to do the wrong thing and say the wrong thing. No, do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, because you're not going to learn otherwise. And that's the problem with these funders, is that we don't tell them, like, you are not doing the right thing. You are not showing up in the right way. And because we're afraid of losing money, it's useless money if the people can't spend it anyway, right? Like we have an example of that at the coalition where we showed up with money and they couldn't spend it. So please always include these line items for culturally appropriate needs, for healing needs, for ceremony needs, because that's what we're asking for. These listening sessions told us that this is what they need. And the youth will give you something different. The youth may ask for iPods, but you know what those iPods can be used for? Language apps. And you know what is a facet of healing? Rejuvenating our Indigenous languages. Like, so all of that connects and all of it is appropriate. We can't decide what's appropriate for people of color or Indigenous people. They tell us what's appropriate based on what their needs are in those spaces. So I'm a dissenter. I disobey. I push the boundaries of my container all the time. I really challenge everything. And I encourage you all to have the courage to do the same thing. Challenge what you know, challenge what you've been led to believe. Always ask questions, show up in a good way, show up with food, and be willing to take the feedback to be better in the way that you're showing up to serve Indigenous communities. So that'll be my final thought, since I'm time checked in a couple of different places. Deep gratitude for you all showing up today. Please use my email if you have any follow-up questions or need some additional resources. I am merely at the Idaho Coalition, not far from some of y'all, and I look forward to seeing y'all again soon. Thank you.